Now, one of the most common questions I get asked is, what do I think is wrong with Star Wars today? Why does it seem like overall interest is fading in it, and what can be done to fix that? And if you don't think that's the case, if you don't think Star Wars is losing any popularity, I'll point out that even the CEO of Disney, Bob Iger, has acknowledged some problems or mishandling of the franchise, which led to him announcing last September that a slowdown of the movies was coming, which also seemed to include the cancellation of any more Star Wars stories like Rogue One and Solo were. And to give you the very quick and simple reason why I believe this is the case, why Star Wars is not thriving in an age where we have more of it than ever before, well, it's because it's not about telling great stories anymore. It's more about selling a product and, to some degree many believe, also pushing an agenda with the franchise. And though that might sound very self-explanatory and like it requires no further explanation, let's nevertheless begin to further examine just what I mean by that. And I'll start by pointing out that in the roughly 35 years that George Lucas owned a Lucasfilm, and hence owned the rights to Star Wars, we got only 6 movies from him, not counting the Clone Wars movie, which was really just several episodes of the series bunched together to make a film. But now, in the 7 years Disney has owned it, we'll already be getting our 5th film under them this December. And keeping that in mind, I'll now ask you this question. Why do you think George Lucas made the first Star Wars movie? And sure, let's be completely honest here. One of the reasons certainly was to make money and to advance his career. Of course it was. But another was he actually had a vision for a story that he wanted to tell, and he was excited and passionate about creating it, and he got rejected time and time again before finally Alan Ladd Jr. at 20th Century Fox just saw something in George Lucas and gave him the chance to make his movie. And though Ladd had his doubts about this crazy idea called Star Wars, and he didn't know how they were ever going to pull it off, he did believe and have faith in Lucas and his creativity and passion for what he wanted to do. Even though, all in all, it was a crazy idea to get behind, because back then, in the early to mid-70s, when Lucas started to develop and pitch the idea for the first Star Wars film, even the biggest sci-fi movies of the time, like the original Planet of the Apes films or 2001: A Space Odyssey, did only modestly well at the box office. Sci-fi had a very small niche market back then, and it also wasn't a very profitable one. So, other than maybe in his wildest dreams perhaps, George Lucas never thought what he was creating would one day turn into a multi-billion-dollar franchise. Nor was it his goal to create that. It was just about making one good movie and telling one good story. And that's, of course, one of the main reasons he was indeed successful, because unlike so many films today, which you can tell are trying to launch a franchise, so they bloat their movie with unnecessary setup for future films, and it ends up hampering the film so much that their dreams of being the next MCU die right there at the start. Anyway, Lucas instead only focused on the story at hand. Though yes, he did have the hope of being able to tell an even grander story one day. But even if episode 5 and 6 never got made, Star Wars, the first movie, would be able to stand on its own as a good singular story. Thankfully though, after the massive and unexpected success of Star Wars, or A New Hope as we call it today, he was able to go on to make 2 more movies and to round out what we now call the original trilogy. And what did Lucas do next? What did he do when the whole world was in love with Star Wars and would have eaten up another Star Wars movie pretty much no matter what it might be about? Well, he waited 16 years before making another one, and instead of making sequels, which almost undoubtedly would have been even more successful and profitable, he made prequels. He told the story he wanted to tell, and had always planned on telling. But the real key factor is that there was indeed a story there to be told about the rise of Vader and the Empire, and the fall of Anakin and the Jedi. And then when the prequels were done, he said he wouldn't make sequels because there was no more story left to tell. That was it. Something that, yes, he later did change his stance on when he apparently found one to tell. But originally, his thinking was that if there isn't a story to be told, then there isn't a movie to be made. But when Disney purchased Lucasfilm, and the first thing they announced is that they're going to make a sequel trilogy, it became the opposite. There were now movies to be made, and so they had to find a story to tell. And let's be as fair as we can be on all fronts here. Yes, obviously, Disney paid a little over $4 billion for Lucasfilm because they wanted to make their money back and then some, by giving us many more Star Wars films than Lucas ever could or would. And initially, or on the surface at least, that didn't seem like too bad of a deal for anybody, and it could have been a beautiful arrangement for all parties if Disney had just managed to handle things a little bit better from the start and have an actual game plan in place before going forward. And sure, no more George Lucas and a mega corporation now owning it made many of his fans leery at the very least, and some of us straight up terrified. But again, Keeping it real here, George Lucas isn't going to live forever, and if Star Wars is going to carry on into the future, which most of us fans likely wanted it to, someone else was eventually going to have to be given the reins, and according to Lucas anyway, he thought the best hands to put it in were Disney's. And so at the time of the sale of Lucasfilm, I think there was this thought or hope or expectation out of the fans that Disney would manage to somehow find just the right people to make these movies, and settle for nothing less. That they'd have a line going out the door with people ready to pitch their ideas for the sequel trilogy, and they'd look for just the right idea and decide upon it before proceeding with any of the films. And that they would handle this franchise that they paid all this money for with the greatest of care so that more Star Wars could be the gift that kept on giving for all parties involved. We fans were constantly getting great Star Wars movies, and Disney and Lucasfilm were lining their pockets with profits from all of us. But the crazy thing here is, the guy they found to do the first movie for them was J.J. Abrams, and he initially turned them down when asked to do Episode 7, but because they had their mind set on him as being their writer and director, and they weren't interested in just finding the perfect story, they eventually convinced him to do it, and we ended up with The Force Awakens, which is a movie that feels like the original trilogy all over again, most likely because J.J. Abrams either didn't know what else to do with it, or because that's what Disney and or Lucasfilm instructed him to make, something familiar to lure the fans back in. Either way, it wasn't a new story, and arguably, it wasn't one that even needed to be told, other than to, again, just lure people back into the franchise and keep them around with the promise of something more in the next movie, when all the mysteries that The Force Awakens brought up would be hopefully answered well. But then they went out and got Rian Johnson to do Episode 8, who started to write it before 7 was even done filming, and before he even met with J.J. Abrams to discuss anything, including the story. Though, thanks to Mark Hamill, we know that he did ask that the ending of Episode 8 be changed from Rey finding Luke on the island meditating with rocks floating around him, to just finding Luke standing there, decked out in his Jedi best, just because, I guess. And quite frankly, nothing tells us just how different the mindsets of those telling this story are better than this, because clearly Abrams intended for Luke to still very much be a Jedi, and the hero we remember, and he'd gone to the island for a very good reason, likely to stop Snoke or something along those lines. While Johnson, on the other hand, thought the exact opposite, and that Luke had gone to the island just to die alone after all his failures or something. Also, thanks to Ram Bergman, one of the producers on The Last Jedi, we also know that, by and large, the very first draft of Episode 8 from Rian Johnson was kept with very few changes, and so, love it or hate it, we ended up with the most controversial Star Wars movie we ever may see, that being The Last Jedi. And now with Episode 9, it's back to J.J. Abrams for damage control, apparently. Simply put, the story of the sequel trilogy, at least from my perspective, seems secondary at best, like something they're just making up as they go because they gotta keep making these movies to get their money. Again, like I said at the start of this video, whereas George Lucas had a story and sought a way to tell it and fought for a way to tell it, now Star Wars is about looking for people to tell us some stories just to make money. And instead of going out looking for someone to make these movies, why not let the next George Lucas, if there ever is going to be one, come to you with some idea for the next trilogy? Or look in-house at Dave Filoni, who worked closely with Lucas for years, and see what he thinks might be best for the franchise. However, the recent hiring of Weiss and Benioff from Game of Thrones fame is more evidence that that's not happening. Their thinking seems to be that since these two made a great show for HBO that so many people loved, of course they can do the same for Star Wars, right? I'm sure they'll just figure out a good story to tell. No need to worry about that in advance. I mean, not like they had any problems figuring out how to end Game of Thrones when they ran out of Martin's books to work from, right? And speaking of books, that reminds me of another question I get asked quite often, which, as you'll see in a moment, is very relevant to this topic. That being, if I'm primarily a Star Wars channel, which I do still consider myself despite the fact I have branched out a little bit as of late, why is it that I rarely ever make videos on any of the other sources of canon, like the books or comics? And, well, honestly, I wouldn't mind doing that. In fact, I'd love to make videos about all those other stories because, yes, I do keep up and read all the books, comics, and so on that come out and are considered canon. But if I was going to do videos like that, I'd like to be able to break down the stories, their structure, and talk about the character arcs and so on. But the problem with that is, there usually isn't a whole lot of analyzing to be done in that respect. Because, more often than not, a good story should show some sort of degree of change in the character or characters it features. In other words, They shouldn't be the same people at the end of the story that they were at the beginning, otherwise what's the point of the story? And so the problem with the new canon is that almost all of the books or comics in it feature well-known and established characters. For example, take the mainline Star Wars title from Marvel Comics right now, which started out by picking up after the events of Episode 4 and primarily feature the heroes from that movie. And after nearly 70 issues now and over 4 years in production, it's still between the events of Episodes 4 and 5, which of course leads to a couple questions or problems, not the least of which is just how many adventures did Han, Luke, and Leia have in the 3-year gap between those movies? How many times can they be captured by the Empire or narrowly escape death before it just gets old and ridiculous? Not to mention, there's not a whole lot of progression you can do with these characters in this time period. We know where they were at the end of A New Hope, and we know where they'll be when The Empire Strikes Back starts. And so what you can do with them is extremely limited, yet they just keep milking this time period with this comic book. And sure, there has been some interesting stuff mixed in there, like learning how Vader figures out that Luke is his son, and that Palpatine lied to him about Padme's death. But the thing about that is, it's good because there's actually a story there to be told, and a progression or change in a character to be had, that being with Darth Vader. Learning that he has a son, and us knowing that son will save him someday, is relevant to the bigger story, and makes for some powerful moments in those issues. It's actually worth reading. Whereas I can't say the same about a lot of the other story arcs that do nothing but give us generic stories that no one would read or care about if it wasn't Star Wars. Which is the huge problem with the other sources of canon. Who would really read them or care about them if they weren't Star Wars? If they didn't offer some little factoids of information about these characters we know and love? Most of the time, there's no real story to be told, but they're telling one anyway because they know idiots like me will buy it and read it anyway. And it's never anything real important, even if they try to advertise like it will be. Take the Aftermath trilogy. The first book in it was part of their Journey to the Force Awakens campaign or marketing, yet had absolutely nothing to do with that movie. And after 3 books, nothing really relevant to the greater story was revealed. Then there's the book Bloodline, which was advertised as having input or story elements directly from Rian Johnson himself, and would tie into The Last Jedi. And of course it didn't do that. It was set 6 years before the events of the movie, and gave us an interesting look at the political landscape of the time. But when The Last Jedi opens with the line, "The First Order reigns," what does it really matter to the movie how the now utterly destroyed Republic worked? And so what's really wrong with the other sources of canon today, and why the old expanded universe, now called Legends, was so much better, is because the books and comics in the old EU actually not only progressed the story, they were the story, and that was that. For the most part, they weren't just writing random, irrelevant stories about the characters we already knew, set in time periods where they couldn't do much with them. They were carrying the stories of those beloved characters forward and in a meaningful way, whereas the sequel trilogy didn't do that. It instead used these old characters' legacies to try and push new characters, and didn't care what happened to those old characters' legacies after they were done with them. Not to mention, it feels like the new sources of canon actively avoid the stories we really might be interested in. Like they're afraid to give us anything too big or important or groundbreaking in a book or comic, because maybe a movie or other bigger story might want to cover it someday. I mean, can we get the story of Ben Solo and Luke already? Can we finally learn about Luke's new Jedi Order, Ben's training, and where it all went wrong and how Snoke influenced Ben and turned his heart to the dark side? I mean, that's actually a far more interesting story in waiting than the sequel trilogy has been. And quite frankly, learning more about Luke is what I wanted out of the sequel trilogy, but they instead decided to push brand new characters without finding a great story to tell about them first. Anyway, before I keep rambling on and griping, let me quickly summarize and then tell you how simple this all could have been, and really still could be, to get right. The goal with the sequel trilogy was not to tell the best possible story, it was to establish a new Star Wars time period and characters that they hoped would be extremely profitable and that they could bank on for years to come, and for some reason they thought the best way to do that was to springboard off the back of the old characters, and don't ask me why they thought that'd work. Look at the new Star Wars themed area in Disneyland and soon to be in Disney World called Galaxy's Edge. It's based off the sequel trilogy time period, and many people ask why they would do that. Well, it's simple. It's because when they were planning it several years ago, before the sequel trilogy even started, they banked on this new time period, or the sequel trilogy era, being popular and well received and of course profitable. They wanted it to be the future of Star Wars. All the while, they gave utterly irrelevant stories to us older fans in the form of books and comics and movies like Solo to keep coaxing money out of us, while they slowly shifted the focus of the franchise away from them. Oh, and yes, I do like Solo, but let's be honest here. The story serves no greater purpose. It was another example of taking a character and looking for a story to tell about them, rather than having a good story to tell that happened to involve a character. However, Rogue One was the opposite of that, and that's why it's my favorite of the Disney Star Wars movies thus far. There was a good, interesting story to tell about how the Rebels got their hands on the Death Star plans, and it just so happened to involve well-known characters like Vader, Tarkin, Leia, and others. And had they just looked for the right story to tell with the sequel trilogy, the best story to tell, and gave it to us no matter what that might be, even if it wasn't what they wanted it to be, most fans would be happy right now. And like it or not, the best story they could have given us was one that focused more on the original trilogy characters, like Luke Skywalker, and then slowly transitioned away from them as the trilogy went on, so that we could become more familiar with the new characters. But they didn't want to do that because they were afraid Luke would steal the show when he showed up, which should really tell them something, shouldn't it? Like, the reason why he would steal the show is because that's what the fans actually wanted to see. Because there was still a story to be told about Luke, and what happened to him after the events of Return of the Jedi. And through him, we could have become invested in the new characters, instead of trying to make us invested in them in spite of Luke. Anyway, the real simple solution for them here is to stop looking at Star Wars as just a brand that they're trying to sell, and to see it from the fans' perspective, which I know is maybe an impossible concept for them to grasp, and to only tell stories where and when a place exists for one. Stop using the old characters to sell boring books and comics that can't or won't offer anything new or interesting about them, other than some rare exceptions like the second volume of the Darth Vader comics, and start looking for some compelling stories and just tell them no matter what characters they may or may not involve. Not to mention, find the right passionate people to tell these stories already, or stop hamstringing the ones you have, the ones who are writing these Star Wars books who probably have fantastic ideas that you just won't let them explore, because heaven forbid something truly epic and important happens in a book and not on the big screen. And let real creators and storytellers come to you with their ideas for these films, and stop going out and looking for the next big thing, and promising trilogies to people like Rian Johnson before his first Star Wars movie even comes out and tears apart the fan base. And look, Disney and Lucasfilm, if you do this, if you put the story first and we get the right people in there who don't care about any outside agendas and just care about Star Wars and storytelling itself, you'll make the money you clearly so desperately want to make. I again look back at Lucas in the first Star Wars movie. It wasn't about creating a brand or a franchise, it was about telling one story. And once you start doing that, once you start worrying about just telling one good story at a time, whether that be in the form of a movie, book, comic book, animated show, or whatever it might be, you can and will win back the fans. And before you know it, you'll find yourself with the biggest, best, and yes, most profitable franchise in the world once again. Well, that's all I've got for you this time. Now it's your turn to tell me what you think. Is the downfall of Star Wars as simple as losing sight of great storytelling and instead focusing on pushing a brand and an agenda? Or is there much more to it than all of that? Let me know what you think in the comments below, and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.